That's not what I meant. It's not what I'm saying. I was...
Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to really think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time-poor but enthusiasm-rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by Christopher Such.
Hello again.
And Cassie Young.
Hello.
And together, we're going to explore school leadership in small schools. But first, Chris, what you reading for?
Hey, what you reading for?
Over the past couple of weeks, I have been reading Diversity in Schools by Benny Cara. It is a fantastic little book about, as you would imagine, diversity in schools. An introductory guide, I think perfect for an ECT or anyone who just doesn't know a great deal on the subject, into an understanding of protected characteristics, on disabilities, much more than that though. It is just a glorious little guide for anyone who's tripping over themselves with bits of language relating to this subject. It gives a wonderful set of recommendations for places to go next in your reading. And yeah, it's made me realize how little I know about this subject and how much more I'd like to know. What about you, Cass? What are you reading for?
I'm reading you've made me feel better, Chris, actually, because I don't feel so nerdy, but I'm reading Leading Academy Trust by David Carter. I think it's like Why Some Trusts Fail But Most Don't or something. But yes, I'm reading it because I suddenly feel really responsible in my new job and should probably learn a bit more about how maths work. And I really like, I've listened to him talk a couple of times, and I really like he's just a realist, and I think that it's all about community and about pulling people together and being outward facing. And I really like the schools of the trust and trust of the schools, and that's kind of what we're trying to build in my new trust. So yeah, I think I'm learning a lot from it, and it's not intimidating. I think some books, particularly around new ideas and new structures, can be a little bit intimidating, but I don't find that. Yeah, I find it accessible, and I can just pick it up and read a couple of chapters and then put it down and think about it. So it's not like a big rush through. And I'm seeing a lot of kind of mirroring and reflection going on as I'm reading it further and further.
What about you, Kieran? What are you reading for?
Nice. They both sound really interesting. I have started Tools for Teachers, which is by Oliver Lovell, the host of the Education Research Reading Room, wonderful podcast that myself and Mrs. Michael listen to regularly on the way to work. And yeah, it's got some really interesting insights and distillations of some of the chats that have gone before. And yeah, I think definitely worth checking out. I'm enjoying reading it so far. So Cassie, it's lovely to have you back. Obviously, this is going to be slightly different from before, and in particular because Christopher, you're going to take the reins.
Yep, excited by that. So because we're talking about small school leadership this week, I get to play host for a little bit, specifically because I know very little about this subject. I was in a one form entry school in my teacher training year, but that's about as far as it went. Whereas both of you have significant experience in smaller schools, so I get to pick your brains. So I guess the first question, and the most obvious one, is what kind of big differences jump out at you in terms of leading a small school compared to one that's a bit more standard?
I think it's probably the amount that you need to do. I really do think that that's the difference. I think that you have to wear multiple hats. So you have to have quite a wide skill set, but you also, I think, have more opportunities in a small school because there aren't many people to do all the jobs. So you end up picking things up that you might not necessarily have intended or thought about doing. And I think that's probably the biggest difference.
In terms of the number of people who are around, I find that there's a big difference in capacity. You know, in terms of if you're trying to map out the right person for the right job, like Chris, like we talked about when we talked about subject leadership and empowering middle leaders. Well, if there are only 2 full-time members of staff available, they can't all be or both be passionate about history, geography, science, DT, religious education, the list goes on. And, you know, so I find whenever I'm giving advice to that extent, when you look at, you know, for instance, we're in Kent, and some of the farming villages will have a school that provides for that village, and that village might have 10 children, 15 children. You know, I think there's a big difference in terms of what your ideal might be in terms of the provision of education. And it might be that a complete mindset, you know, not shift, but you might need a completely different mindset in that situation than you would in a slightly larger school. So, you know, I've experienced working in 1, 2, and 3 form entry schools. And I think the biggest difference is along those lines. You know, you're talking about, Cass, about how you can progress quicker, or how there are more opportunities. Sorry, progress quicker was my phrase. That's what came to mind, because I think I've seen people in 3 form entry schools take a lot longer to progress up the ladder than people in 1 form entry schools, simply because, like you say, there's no one else around to do the job, so you get to do it. And, you know, like, you know, normally before promotion, you do the job without getting paid for it, and then you get the job. You know, that certainly outside work in my experience.
Yeah, definitely. I think that has pros and cons. I think sometimes you are doing a job before you are naturally ready for that kind of next step. And I think sometimes that's intimidating. If I think about my job, I started as a Senko 2 days a week, 3 days a week, and then I was an assistant head really quickly, and then I was head really quickly. And I think there was a point where I just thought, I am not capable of doing this job at all. And luckily I had a really good coach and mentor, and I had a good group of staff around me that had worked with me as a colleague. And sometimes that doesn't work out particularly well, because taking the shift into a senior leadership role when you've worked with colleagues can be really difficult. But luckily we were all kind of really passionate about the school and the uniqueness of the school, and we wanted to keep that going. So they were all there kind of supporting me in that, and kind of adding more capacity as we went. But we went from 12, originally I had 12 staff and 44 children, and when I finished, I think we had 101 children and 20 staff. So the shift from a really, really small school went to a small school. I don't think it hit, there is a threshold for groupings as well. I think it's something like 120 or something to be officially a small school. Even that, you know, we doubled the role, more than doubled the role, and actually the dynamics changed even from that to that. And I remember standing my first day as head of school, and there were 3 rows of children, and I was standing waiting at the front, and one of the staff just said, "They're all here." I was just like, this is mad. We're in this massive hall and there's just 3 lines of children and that's it. So yeah, I think it's definitely an interesting place to work, and I think there are real strengths in small schools.
I mean, so I would imagine in a lot of small schools, a key thing is that your senior leadership team are going to have significant amounts of teaching time as part of their role. Do you find that this changes their perspective at all? Because obviously I know that some head teachers, in my experience, can feel a little distant from the chalk face, and so will suggest things that maybe don't quite work out, and you know they're not going to work out. Does that not apply at small schools, because the head teacher is much more likely to have a part in the teaching?
Yes. I was slightly different because I was the Senko and the head. So I was working quite closely with pupils with SEND across the school. So I had, and that was really difficult because it's a head and heart position to be the Senko and the head. So there were, and I talked about this previously with Kieran, that sometimes you have to make really tough decisions with your head hat on, and sometimes you really have to fight the fight and champion some children that not necessarily in bigger schools there would have been other decisions made, and that's really difficult. But the really good thing is that we had the opportunity, because I only had 4 teachers, all of those teachers for a year taught their specific subjects. So even though some of them aren't passionate about humanities or the arts, and they were given those subjects, we said, look, to make sure you get a really good understanding of what that curriculum looks like, teach children from reception to year 6. And they established those relationships really well. And I think that really supported things like transition, but it also really helped with the CPD for subject specialism, because my music lead knew exactly what music looked like in reception and his own class in 3 and 4 and in 5 and 6, because he taught it all the way through. And it was quite funny for our 5-6 teacher. He's like, I've got all of these reception children saying hello to me. I know, isn't it weird to be seen as this scary year 6 teacher, but actually you're teaching reception, and you've formed those relationships across the schools. But yeah, I think you are very operational rather than strategic in a small school, because there isn't kind of a banding in between. You don't really have that. I don't know if your experience was different, Kieran.
Yeah, I think by the nature of the fact that it's entirely possible to know everyone and every pupil, those relationships are slightly different. And I think it becomes more difficult. It's definitely possible that you can become so far removed from the classroom, or just as far removed from the classroom as you might do in a secondary, or not a secondary, a 2-form or 3-form elementary school. But I think it's slightly more difficult to fall into that trap, because for a small school to work well, everybody needs to be pushing in the same direction, because with fewer links, each of them has slightly greater significance in the movement of the machine. And I'm not saying that, I know that for a fact that a successful school, no matter what size, everyone will be moving in the same direction. But I think a broken cog, tell me when this metaphor falls down, Chris, when there are fewer of them, causes more damage, I think. And so I completely agree. My experience would be the same, but there's a sense of community that comes with that as well, that you almost feel like this is our thing. We are, because we're all driving the same direction, we're all trying to get to the same endpoint. And because I think at times it can be tougher.
I was just going to say, yeah, I totally see that, because I think in a bigger school, if you've got a few people that aren't on board, it's not as noticeable, because you've got the majority of doing, they've got the vision, they've got the value, they've got the ethos, and they're kind of moving along. When you've got a handful of people and you've got 2 people that are kind of blockers to something, or they don't agree, they have a much more amplified voice. And you have to, because those people so much more, it's not about pinging an email out saying, well, you need to get on board, and if you want a conversation, you are literally in the same room as them, and you're having those challenging conversations face to face, because actually that's, the great thing is you can send a message in the room, you can have a meeting with everyone in, you don't have to rearrange a whole week's worth of things to have all of the staff in the same room. You can do that on a Monday morning, and have everyone in the room within a couple of minutes. But you're right. I think if you have to work harder at getting absolutely everyone on board, because one person does make a big difference.
I think you're also doing that with a limited or more limited budget. Certainly the people I've talked to, when I talk to colleagues about their 2-form entry budget and colleagues about their 1-form entry budget, there's quite a big gap. And I think that almost, you have, one of the reasons why schools were pushed towards academization was so they could have this combined spending power and these economies of scale. Where that's absent, and I think fewer than 50% are actual academies are part of multi-academy trust at the moment. Maybe it's around the 50% ballpark. You've got these schools who are trying to do great things, but almost pushing that stone up the hill in that respect. I'm not trying to sell a real negative picture. I just think there are distinct challenges that come with being in a small school, because some of the strengths are that sense of community, and the fact that everyone, all the kids. But I think with greater resources come greater opportunities in a lot of instances.
I hadn't thought about that at all. The idea that if you've got 4 teachers in a school, that there is this sense of, presumably, that it's theirs in a way that a school of 30 teachers, it isn't. You've got your class. I wondered along those lines, I know this is probably a bit specific. Have you ever been in a situation or heard of a situation where a school with very few teachers loses like a couple of teachers? Because presumably if you've got 4 or 5 and 3 all leave at the same time or are on maternity leave or whatever it might be, it must feel like a massive change in a school compared to, say, somewhere larger where that just feels much more manageable.
I didn't have any teachers when I started my job. I had a couple of supply teachers and a couple of part-time teachers that were leaving, and so we basically started from scratch. And yes, I guess the good thing, I was always looking for the positives. The positive thing was that you could start afresh. It was a baseline for the school, and you were saying, this is how we want things done. It wasn't, this is how it used to be and this is how we want it done now. It was very much, we're starting again and this is what we're going to start on. Behaviour, curriculum. Also, I think the people that started at the same time, we kept the majority of those staff. They're still there now. They felt like they had an in on what we were doing, and they had a voice on what we were creating and the culture that we were building. But to be honest, I really think the difficulty with small schools is that families want their children to go to small schools, particularly if they have additional needs, because they're nurturing environments. You get to know the staff really well. There are less incidents in terms of 60 children in 2 classes that are going out for break. If the whole we were lucky that we had massive playground field, forest school, we had amazing facilities, so we were really, really lucky. But that they do become magnet schools, and then that's when the issues with funding really highlight the difficulties in small schools. And if you have even just a few children leave, that does really impact your budget as well. So you have this really difficult position where you want to be completely inclusive and take all of these children in, which you do. And the cost of that is that sometimes the support that you've originally put in place then has to change again. So you have this kind of onboarding process where you will get another child, and then the support needs to move around and change, and that means that's impacting everyone else. So it's a really tricky balance between saying, yes, come to us because we're a small school and we want to build our numbers. In majority of situations, I say small schools have always got places, particularly in Kent, because it's such a transient kind of community across the whole of Kent. So yeah, it's really hard. It's really hard to balance.
Lots of the time, communities are drawing on those within to make sure that you don't have 2 or 3 people leaving at the same time. So that, because the head teacher will know every single person who works there, on a potentially a familial or 1 or 2 steps removed level. So I think it's really interesting how sort of creative school leaders can be in those situations, but I think that only adds to the camaraderie. Obviously with families it can make things a lot more difficult. Certainly if my family were working in the school with me, I'm not sure how that would go. But I think it's there's a lot of resourcefulness that comes from those kinds of situations.
You mentioned when you were discussing that before, the idea of there was a discussion of subject leadership and curriculum, and I'd quite like to explore that a little bit more, because obviously there's a lot of talk on edu-Twitter about curriculum because of the focus on it from Ofsted, and because it's something that arguably in some places has been underplayed for a while. And a lot of what I see in terms of pushback against some of these conversations is, yeah, but you don't understand how this works in a smaller school. And the reality is I don't, and I'd like to know more. So what are the challenges, idiosyncrasies, things that you think are worth knowing about when it comes to subject leadership and curriculum development in a smaller school, be it one form entry or half form?
I really like developing our curriculum, and I think that I possibly wouldn't have got that opportunity if I was working in a bigger school as a leader, because I think those subject leaders would already be there. There would be enough of them, and they would take each section of their subject and kind of create something, and then we'd all work together to put it together. But I was very mindful of workload with four teachers. Actually, we had five, because we had a schools direct for the last couple of years, and that was really good as well. She was great. But I wanted the school to teach discrete subjects, but we had to group those subjects so that we didn't have teachers with 4 or 5 subjects to lead. So we had the humanities, the arts, etc. And I think that you could really grapple with kind of what that curriculum looked like. And because we were half form, we had a 2-year rolling curriculum. So it was kind of a bit of a jigsaw of, where are we putting things? How are we making sure that we're meeting kind of the national curriculum expectations, that children weren't missing out because they were in split year groups? But also, I really liked the changes to, I've got some stuff to say about Ofsted, but I quite like their focus on curriculum. And I really liked the wider curriculum focus. And that really allowed us to think about what those subjects look like from reception to year 6. So I think we all kind of could muck in with the curriculum development, but I really liked the fact that I could have control over what that looked like. And then when we started working with subject leaders, it also gave us the opportunity to be a bit more outward facing. I was really aware, because there were sometimes 5 of us sat around the table, actually we don't have the expertise for all of these subjects. So we worked with secondary schools and other bigger primaries, and we kind of pulled in other subject leaders, and we asked people that were developing curriculums, particularly knowledge-rich curriculums, to look at what we were developing to make sure that we were on the right track. So I think there was a deliberate decision that we would be more outward-facing when we were developing that, and that might not have happened with more people.
I love that idea. I mean, I love the way that you've expressed that, because it's definitely the case, I think, that in some of the slightly larger schools that I've worked in, there's been a sense of self-reliance, which has often had benefits, but in certain areas has led to not enough of bringing in expertise from the outside, not enough of just quality assurance from people outside of the organization. So that makes total sense to me that you would have the reverse of that. There's a natural humility that comes from recognizing that there's no way, of course, we can all be experts. There's only 4 of us here. So even if one of us had a history degree and one of us had a geography degree, you're going to run out. So yeah, that's I hadn't cottoned onto that idea at all. That's really thoughtful. I'm gonna have to say, you mentioned Ofsted. When it comes to curriculum, lots of people think that they are not as understanding as they could be of the particular challenges of smaller schools when it comes to curriculum development, but also how curriculum is delivered. Would you say those criticisms are fair in your experience?
Actually, I wouldn't. Oh, I sound like I'm sort of championing Ofsted now. I'm really not. But I have. It's been mixed, actually. I've been through quite a few Ofsteds now in the new role, so I'm having very mixed experiences on curriculum. They've all been fair, to be fair, but I think that Ofsted had recognised not immediately, but I think when the curriculum kind of framework came out, I think they got a lot of kickback from small schools. And I think small schools really found their voice in that particular argument, because a lot of the webinars that I've been to run by HMIs are very specific about small school expectations. And I really want to make it clear that small schools were not asking for leeway or lowering expectations because they were small schools, but it was understanding the nuance and the uniqueness and the strengths and weaknesses that come with small schools. And I don't know whether that's been communicated as clearly as it could have been, but I always felt like saying, but we're not asking for you to say, oh, well, you've only got 4 teachers, therefore you only have to do 4 subjects really well, because small schools offer a full curriculum. Everyone gets their entitlement, and they work incredibly hard. But I think really good inspectors that I've worked alongside during inspections have understand that small schools do have slightly different setups, but are doing as well, if not in some cases better jobs than bigger schools.
I think the elephant in the room could potentially be that Ofsted in many instances are the driver for these changes in attitudes towards curriculum. Because as I was thinking about that question, when I was in a one-form entry school, I was there for about 7 years, and my first year I was RE lead. Second year I was RE lead. And I know that of the 7 teachers, maybe some people had 2 or 3 subjects, but they would be the less important subjects back then. They might still be less important, but they certainly got a lot less attention. Was it information computer technology? That was learning to use software on a computer every now and again. And so, now I'm thinking, okay, well, would we have had the same capacity to do the job that we are expected to do now had we had to, be an effective DT, art and religion subject leader? And I think trying to think of something practical and useful to say about this is Lloyd's 3-phase model. I think that would work particularly well in one form or fewer, half-form entry schools, because you could almost have like a high-quality scheme in place for the subjects that you don't have time to attend to right now. And you could use your 4 teachers focusing on your 3 core, priorities. And then in year 2, those plates can spin. Well, let's focus on how, computer science and technology tie up with each other. And then year 3, and then that cycles back around. I don't know, because I was trying to think, hand on heart, when I was RE lead, was I trying my best to develop curriculum? No, I think I was organizing the Christmas stuff and the Easter stuff and the special days and things like that there. But did I ever sit and think about how I would sequence the religion curriculum? No, because it already existed from Kent. And I think we possibly, as a maintained school, we have to use that anyway. So maybe it's not a great example, but it didn't cross my mind. And if we think about someone like Neil, who is clearly very talented when it comes to curriculum, even he knows when to sit back on subjects that he doesn't know that much about, because he knows a phenomenal amount about history and geography, but he has the sense to say, oh, actually, I know a little bit less about that. This is not a conversation I can get involved in, if that makes sense. And so when people who spend so much of their spare time developing their subject knowledge feel like that, I think we need to think carefully about the systems we have in place to support the leaders, the middle leaders in particular, in a smaller setting, so that they can do the things that will really enrich them as professionals and the experience our pupils get.
I think that does lead on to recruitment as well, doesn't it? Because when I started recruiting people, I was trying to be as specific as I could be about the gaps that we had. And that was really difficult because it's a small school and I'm asking for a specific subject specialism. Or I was talking to my teachers that were in place saying, would you consider taking on a subject that you've never had an interest in? I think good leadership is good leadership, though. And I think if you've got the backup of someone that is knowledgeable with their subject knowledge and they're saying, yeah, that would work, and they're giving you the content, then managing and leading a subject, I think is pretty kind of standard in most of the subjects. Please correct me if I'm talking absolute rubbish, but that's how I feel. That and I think Ofsted have said a few times, you know, we're not expecting you to we're not expecting to have this deep fundamental degree level knowledge in the subjects that you're teaching, but you need to know what your subject looks like and how it builds and how you're going to put those kind of milestones in to make sure that you know how your children are doing.
On the subject of recruitment, and I apologise if this is a little diversion, do you think that there are particular characteristics of teachers in particular that suit smaller schools? I mean, I'm certain, of course, that there's an extent to which, you know, a good teacher is a good teacher, but are there particular ways of thinking about teaching? Are there particular ways of thinking about planning that certain teachers have that make them particularly maybe enjoy working in a smaller setting?
I was waiting for Kieran, but he's not going to speak. So
just being polite. You're the guest.
You were being polite. You don't need to be polite. I'll interrupt you, I'm sure. I think that some teachers I think small schools are a bit Marmite. You either really like them or you really don't. And I think the people that would assume that they don't like it haven't taught in a small school. I know that when I was in art, I did a placement. I worked in bigger schools. When I was working in London, I worked in a bigger school, and on some of the placements, I was working in really big schools. And there was that reliance on colleagues for planning. So you'd share out your planning, and then you would kind of hope that they'd send it back at some point so you could look at it and adjust it and look at scaffolding, etc., for your class and make it more specific to the needs in your class. And I didn't particularly like that because I was relying on other people's planning, and people don't always like using other people's plans. They like to have ownership of what they're teaching and when they're teaching it and how they're teaching it. So I think a lot of small school teachers like that. They like to have control over their own planning. I think that the workload in terms of planning can be more difficult to maintain. And that's why everyone has to kind of muck in at that point. So those medium-term plans and those long-term plans have to be shared and created together. But yeah, I think it's very dependent on that person. I think they need to have really good time management skills, and they need to be willing to take on a subject that they're not necessarily particularly fond of or interested in. I think that's teaching. I think teachers are adaptable, aren't they? I think a lot of teachers, majority of teachers, are adaptable and ready to give things a go. I think once you're in a small school, if you like it, that's where you stay.
One other important thing is that teachers love control, certainly in my experience. And you're not going to get any more control than when you've got, I think, Chris, you described it before as your own little island where you're responsible for what happens, makes a big difference. And there's a big shock whenever you have to split planning with someone else, because I think in most instances where you've been brought up doing it yourself, you end up just doing it yourself anyway, don't you? And because that's the way that you've sort of gotten into the habit of preparing for lessons. So I think like you say, Cass, people who haven't been in a small school, they don't realize the upside. And one of those upsides is that full grasp of everything that's happening in your domain or in your kingdom. And I use those words slightly in jest, but it is nice to know that you are in control. That sense of security can be really reassuring sometimes. And when there's a wild card at play, whether that be your year group partner or somebody else in your phase, that can make life a little bit more stressful. So I think to become a fully rounded teacher, getting experience in as many different contexts as possible is definitely to be recommended. You know, I think to go to your original question, Chris, when I think about the type of teacher, the type of planning you have to do, because I was sort of brought up on the old national strategies, and we were sitting in August and we decided what we wanted to teach, you know, for the rest of the year. We mapped it all out, you know. The word textbook wasn't to be uttered within the school walls and things. I don't know if it'd be different now. You know, I hope on some level it would be, where, for instance, a small school with a paucity of expertise in science might decide to use Reach and their resources or a similar kind of product, so that while teachers developed their understanding, they at least had something there. I don't know.
What I really liked is when White Rose created split year group planning, because I could just hear cheers across the country, all these little schools going, yes, we don't have to juggle these ridiculous objectives. We're not teaching, you know, time and capacity to one year group when we're supposed to be doing shape in another, and how are we going to teach that? I think you have to be really skilled to teach a split year group class, particularly maths. Writing is easier because you could set the same objective, but then you structure and scaffold up or down and decide what the outcomes are going to look like for each of the year groups. But yeah, things like that, you have to be absolutely on it. And I've seen so many different ways to teach 2 year groups in the same class. Either they've split it down the middle and they've set one group off to do one thing, and you know, maths fluency, and while they do the input for the other side, or they teach the whole class and then say, you're going to do this, you're doing this. You know, I think it's fascinating because I'm now working with a lot of small schools. I think 7 out of the 10 of my schools are small, either one form or less, and I've seen so many really creative ways to teach really strong lessons. And I think that takes a certain type of, you need to have a real strategic kind of thought process in how, and that's not just, this is the method I'm going for and that's it for the academic year. It's from day to day, how are we going to get this lesson to match the kind of abilities in the class?
Is there a sense within smaller schools that you have to be slightly more willing to ignore what seems to other people like sound advice? So what I mean by that is, someone got in touch with me when I was talking about reading and saying that I think as a default structure for teaching reading, your go-to should be whole class reading. And they said, that's great. I teach in a school where in my class, I have children from reception all the way up to year 6. How do I do that? And my immediate response was, oh, well, obviously not. Obviously you don't do that then. If you're teaching kids phonics over here and over there, you've got kids who absolutely can cope with, you know, his dark materials, then yeah, that you obviously have to know when to ignore people like me, because our advice isn't necessarily aimed at situations quite so individual as that. So is there an extent to which you have to trust your own judgment a bit more and say, yeah, and that person might be given good advice, but it really doesn't apply here?
I'd really love to think that there's a little club somewhere that says all of the advice that small schools should ignore, whole class teaching for 4-year grades. Yeah, there is. And there's sometimes you think, oh, that would be so easy to do, and then you think about your own class in your own school and think that's never going to happen. There are some really good things, ridiculous things that you wouldn't think of that small schools are great at. You can go on whole school trips and you need one coach, and you can pick up and drop off is about 3 minutes, and that's great. And you can get everyone in the hall for everything, and you have children from reception to year 6 all know each other's names and have really good relationships. So there are all those things that if you said that as a small school leader, oh, we're going on a whole school trip, those big schools would be like, are you insane? 850 children on a school trip, you know, that's never going to happen. So I think it works both ways. I think that sometimes suggestions are made and small schools just think no, but they adjust and they'll think, yeah, that's a great strategy. Of course small schools do whole class reading, but they'll do it in a slightly different structure, or they'll start everyone on the same level and then they'll scaffold up for different year groups. They'll think of ways, creative ways, to make sure that they're getting the same experience.
I think about kids who have made that transition from primary to secondary, those that have struggled. And in my experience, there have been more struggles when I've, when you used to work in year 6 and you get year 7s come back to visit you. The ones that I've found have come back and said, oh, they've struggled a bit, or I'll speak to parents and they say, yeah, they're really struggling to get on in year 7. It's more common in my experience that they struggle when they've moved to an absolutely massive secondary school. So one of these ones that's 2,000 kids compared to one down the road that's a comprehensive with 600 or 700, which isn't that much of a leap in terms of size. And I wonder, do you think there's a bit more of a challenge for kids when they go from a school that's maybe got 70 or 80 children in it to a secondary school with 1,000 or more, compared to a child who's already got used to this sense of being, and I use the word very carefully, but a small fish in a big pond already at primary? In other words, do you think there's a greater challenge for transition from smaller schools to secondaries, perhaps?
I think all the children I thought would struggle have done really, really well. And all the children I thought would be absolutely fine really struggled, because I think by the time they get to year 6, they have spent so much time with the same children. They are desperate to spend time with other people. And the people and the children that we didn't think required as much nurture or well-being check-ins, or that formed really strong relationships with adults, we think, oh, they're really going to struggle, but actually the groundwork was there that they could form relationships with adults and other children. So when they went to secondary, they're absolutely fine. It always surprised me when I heard about how children were doing. And I would go over to the secondary school in Kent with the grammar stream. A lot of children didn't go to the same schools anyway, so it was kind of normal that some would go here, some would go there. They'd kind of mix and match. And I think that transition work is really important in small schools.
I'm always careful to attribute feelings to pupils that might potentially be adult feelings, if that makes sense. So we can think, oh, they might struggle with X, Y, and Z, but actually they might just, children are a whole lot more resilient than sometimes they're given credit for. I'm not saying you, for a second, Chris, are not giving those children credit for being resilient, but when we hear things like, oh, the children are really tired, well, sometimes that's code for the adults are really tired, or I'm really tired, And so I think, you just got to see what happens in that situation, because I don't necessarily think it's easier for a child who's been to a big school to settle more quickly. They may not have enjoyed their time in that big school, and then they'll think, well, here we go again, but this time for 7 more years. So who knows?
Something that I've not had the chance to ask yet, and I'd like to dive into. When it comes to setting like a culture, and I'm thinking particularly in relation to behaviour, are there any differences there in terms of working in a small school compared to something larger?
I think it's easier to get your expectations across because there's less adults. So that consistency and expectation, is it easier? Yeah, I think it is. It's easier. It's not necessarily easier to get the behaviour culture that you want immediately, but I do think it's easier to get the kind of your expectations, this is what we want the culture to be, this is what the strategies that we're going to use. I think centralising, people talk about centralising behaviour, and when you are the only member of SLT, that's really hard, because you have to have, our setup was a head of school and 2 senior teachers, So you had to kind of rely on the senior teachers to pick up behaviour as well, because you are in meetings off-site, you know, you're not always consistently there. I think in the first couple of years I was pretty much, I couldn't leave the school because we were setting that expectation, and there was that consistency that needed to happen. I think it's easier in that way, but I really thought about individual children, because I think that when you're in a small school, children that aren't necessarily conforming to what you've asked them to do stand out a hell of a lot more than in a big school. So you kind of get that drift in big schools where you'll have those children that, you know, might fidget or might wind each other up. And if you've got a class of 30 or a cohort of 90, you wouldn't notice them as much. But in a small school, if there's 10 of them and one of them is being a wind-up merchant, you instantly are kind of on them. So I'm not suggesting that behaviour expectations are higher in a small school, but I would say that you pick things up much quicker.
I've seen similar systems work in small and larger schools. A lot of the principles of effective behavior management are the same, but I think those distinctions are the ones that Cassie draws. You know, so if you have high expectations of behavior, if you make sure that it's the consistency rather than the severity, if you are fair, but also show children where the, you know, where the absolute limit is, then, you know, you're sort of encouraging positive behavior, you know. And I think that's true whether you've got 10 pupils or, you know, maybe 400 or more. But it is that intensity. And I think it's an intensity that's shared across, you know, all the key features of school life. You've almost got this little, you know, I'm thinking of a nucleus, but it's not a nucleus, but it's like this hub. Whereas when the distance from the hub is greater, you know, you've got fewer points of interference. I don't know. Need to work on that one. Maybe I'll come back in a couple of weeks.
I don't know as well. I think the things that I found difficult, and I know that other small school leaders feel the same, is that there is no kind of steps between what happens in the class if behaviour escalates to a point where that child needs to be removed, or we use good to be green, which is a standard kind of strategy. If they got a red card, they would be sent out for 10 minutes, they'd be sent to another class for 10 minutes, or they'd be sent to me. There's no in between. So it feels like quite, not extreme, but there's nowhere else to go. So you go from classroom behaviour management, there isn't a middle leader that's going to kind of step in at that point and kind of bring them back down and put them back in the classroom. You go straight to the head. So that's difficult. And that's the same with parents as well. I found that if parents had an issue, because you are the only person on the gate, they go straight to you, and then there's no one else that you can kind of go to. So we would always, you know, we started sending out the message that if you have an issue, you go to the class teacher first. Even though you're there, you kind of had to have that step away, because otherwise you end up dealing with absolutely everything that's going on in the school. That's where you kind of think, wow, there's an awful lot to get sorted or done.
I was teaching a very long time before I realized that the idea of sending kids to their year group partner was a thing, or to alternate year groups. I remember these children would show up in my classroom. Why are these children here? I know, and then they've done X, Y, and Z, and they need to spend some time because it's the next thing on the, you know, like you said, there's room for escalation. You know, it doesn't need to go to the senior leadership team just yet. I was like, wow, that's a thing. I couldn't believe it.
I guess something that's been hiding under the surface of a lot of what you've said is, I hope, in this question, do you think there's anything that larger schools could learn from smaller schools?
I think it's very much a case of we can always learn from each other, you know, no matter what phase we're in, what size we are, or where we are in the country. And I think it's about making connections between schools and between colleagues, so that the things that are there to be learned, we're open to them when they arrive. I don't think there's one specific thing. Like, me and Cass have talked about our experiences, but you can almost guarantee that there will be, plenty of people listening who have had completely different experiences in small school settings and in large school settings, thinking, oh no, that thing that you said about small schools, that matches up with our two-form entry school, So I think the main thing would be a preparedness to learn when the opportunity arises. And I think that's done by making connections between schools, certainly in our local area in the first instance, because, go back to Matt Swain, and he talks about how when his 3 schools in East Sussex get together, they've got a 6-form entry school rather than a 1, a 2, and a 3. And I think that would be the main thing I would hope for, because you can never quite tell what you're going to learn, and everybody needs to learn slightly different things. But I think there's no greater is better. It's very much a case of, you can have really intense pockets of expertise in a small school. So I think, it's that's a long way of saying, and most of it will probably get cut. And be prepared to learn from others, because there's always stuff we can learn.
I'd probably say exactly the same. That I think in small schools, because you're working with colleagues in different key stages, they learn a lot from each other. And I think in bigger schools, maybe the opportunities aren't there as much to go down, in key stage 2, to go down to reception and nursery and look at practice that's going on in there. But when there is only a handful of teachers, they're the only people that you can talk to about practice. So you're going to get a completely different perspective of how subjects look at different places and strategies and ideas. So I'm not saying that bigger schools can learn that from smaller schools, but I think smaller schools do that more regularly. And I think that does inform their practice going up and down the school. But I think Kieran's right. I think it is about networking generally. I think it is about being outward facing and taking ideas. There's loads of strengths in small schools, and practice goes both ways, doesn't it?
I think the idea that working in a small school means that there is almost an enforced humility relating to what you can ever possibly know about curriculum, and this actually directly leading to curriculum excellence, because you're reaching out, because you're automatically going, we need to network, we need to bring expertise in that perhaps larger schools don't think to do quite so often. You mentioned about whole school trips. Obviously, I know this is not something that's going to be available to larger schools, but the idea of saying, perhaps with a greater degree of frequency, this is something that I want the whole school to take part in, not necessarily a trip, but something that isn't just, I don't know, World Book Day, but something that you think, no, this is a way to build a sense of community, which is something that's come across in a lot of what you've said, the extent to which there is perhaps a greater opportunity to build community because every child recognizes every other child. I'd say the third thing is this sense that arguably there's a greater opportunity for teachers to take ownership and feel like the school is theirs in a way that it isn't necessarily the case in a larger school. And again, this is maybe one that I've picked up that has come across subtly rather than intentionally, but the idea that smaller schools, through necessity, develop a sense in which they are willing to stand their ground in defending their unique personal circumstances in a way that larger schools, because they can feel just a bit more ordinary, might not be quite so ready to do. Again, all of those might be a bit of a reach, but that's a few of the things that I've taken from the conversation in terms of what perhaps larger schools can learn from those people who have worked in and led smaller schools. Worked in and led larger schools.
I think you're spot on. Maybe we just don't want to say small schools are better because...
No, you're not allowed to say that. No, they're definitely not better because I've never worked in one, and that would make me feel very sad.
I think that's what you're saying, Chris. I think that's
I have to say, though, you've genuinely made me think that I've missed out a little bit in my career, that I haven't had that opportunity, that I haven't worked, say, in a 1-form entry or a half-form entry school, just to, you know, get that sense of community, to feel like I've got this small team to work in. Then again, maybe in the future, you never know.
Do you know what the funniest thing is? That most small schools, the buildings are always like little teeny tiny Hogwarts places because they're old buildings that have not been changed for years. So you've got these crazy kind of classroom sizes and walkways. And so if you want to do a tour, Chris, we could do a Kent tour of small schools.
Oh, I'd love that. Yeah, I'd love that. We can go around. Yeah, that. Are there any, just last thing then, I guess, are there any other senses in which smaller schools are like idiosyncratic in that way? I mean, obviously, like you say, the buildings, because, you know, in some cases they're an old village hall or that's been converted or whatever it might be. Are there any other ways in which you think these schools are just a bit odd? Because in my experience of just institutions generally, the smaller they get and the fewer people they have within them, the more that they have the possibility of like having like a unique personality.
One of our schools is surrounded by an apple orchard. Another of our schools you can't drive to, so you have to walk down a lane to get to it. Another one has ducks. Because they're normally rural, they are in really odd places. So every day is a different adventure when you're visiting these schools. I wouldn't say that there's a collective kind of, they're all, you know, different in this way. I quite like that, you know, that all of the schools have autonomy and uniqueness in their own right, as well as being small.
I mean, the one thing when I'm listening to Cassie talk, you know, and I'm thinking, right, well, lots of people ask about what's the answer for small schools, and someone requested we discuss small schools, and I don't think it's going to be for the last time. You know, I said it quite a bit, but I think we need to really talk with lots of people about how they deal with it, because it's the flexibility, and you can't sell flexibility, because if someone was able to sell the answer to small schools, then they would be a millionaire, you know, several times over. And the reason they haven't done that is because it's that flexibility and that thinking on your feet and being prepared to do something completely different on one day that you do on the next day. That's what really stood out whenever I was listening to you speak. And I think that's probably where we pick it up next time when we come back to small school leadership. So all that's left to do is say thank you very much, Cassie.
Thanks. It's been lovely.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks for having me.
And to everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.